I don't think you're on audio, Jessica. I hear you because I'm in the room, but
we still can't hear you,
Still
Jessica.
can't hear you, Jess.
It is recording. Jessica, can you nod that we're ready to go? Or it's not? Okay, we're ready to go.
We're ready to go. Okay, we'll call the meeting to order for the Charter Commission and joint meeting with the City Council. I'd like to do a roll call first here. Lothar, I am here. Phil Christensen. Do we not have Phil here?
Jess, do you know if 2993 is Phil by chance?
I am not sure. I can unmute them.
Should we continue? And
yeah.
Okay. George Gamak.
Here.
Ken Guntner.
Here.
Manoj Thomas.
Here.
Jim Tilbury.
Looks like he's muted.
I don't have everybody's picture, so I can't tell. So is Jim here?
Jim is here. He is just muted.
Okay. Can we get a...
Yep, I'll unmute him.
Can we get Jim to say that he's here? Jim, are you here? Okay. And Mayor Thomas?
here.
Tom Anderson?
Here.
John Bodema?
Present.
Alan Schultz?
Here.
And I also want to welcome Councilman-elect Jeremy Nichols. I felt it would be prudent for him to join us tonight. He's going to be actually coming on the council here, I believe, next week. And so it only makes sense that he would be part of this discussion. Also, welcome first time to Manoj Thomas. This is your first Charter Commission meeting. Welcome. And thank you for participating here. I'd like to begin by inviting you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. So if we could all stand and do the pledge, I'd appreciate it. I pledge allegiance
To the flag
Of the
United States of America.
To the republic for
which
which it stands, under God,
one nation,
indivisible,
under God,
liberty and justice for all.
indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the council, City Council, for being here with us tonight. Just kind of as a refresher, for several years, the Charter Commission has been discussing the potential for creating a ward system in Corcoran. We began the discussions on that after sewer and water became available in the city. We knew that there was going to be development happening, and over the years we've obviously seen development start to really come into our city with Ravinia, obviously the Bass Lake Crossing, the Del Webb development, and of course the future development with Tavera and some of the other Sawgrass and some of the other developments that are happening. So we just felt like it would be prudent to have some discussion about ward systems. And so we really began that discussion about three and a half years ago, maybe a little longer. And we felt like this was a time to, especially with what seems to be on the horizon for a lot more development, that this would be a good time to have more further discussion. And we felt it was also might be a better use of our time if the City Council was actually part of some of the discussion, because ultimately it's a City Council decision. And so with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ken. Ken and I have done a lot of discussion about this in the last year or so. And Ken has done a lot of work in gathering more and more information. So we felt it'd be good for Ken to do a presentation tonight. So Ken, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and then we can have discussion and dialogue after that.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Excuse me. And to those of you whom I haven't met, hello. I haven't been particularly involved in meetings at all since having retired from city government after the 2016 election. I was one of the early proponents of the idea of a ward system in our conversations on the Charter Commission. And I think that led me to spend the time researching it a little bit and looking at the mechanics of how they come about, how they're set up, what authority regulates the use of ward systems. And like Brian said, at least the last couple of Charter Commission meetings, the annual meetings, we've had conversations about the pros and cons of using wards, but we haven't really gotten beyond just very broad discussions. So there haven't been concrete proposals, for example, or discussions about how to take the idea to the next step. And I think really it was a good idea at this time to get feedback from the council as well, because if the Charter Commission is serious about taking next steps, then some attempt needs to be made in actually converting the concept into a specific written proposal that people can start to push and pull at. I do want to comment, there are a couple of paths to adoption of a ward system. A ward system would be created by amendment to our charter. And I think we adopted the charter, George can correct me, maybe back late 80s. I think maybe
it was something like that. I know the charter came in at the time that there was a lot of discussion with some of the folks about the sewer issue.
Okay.
And some of the folks that worked on it were some of the ones that were dealing with Paul Jacobs and the sewer.
Right. So, you know, the Charter Commission itself has met annually since then. There really hasn't been a lot of activity at all on the charter. There was an attempt at a charter amendment back, I want to say early 2000s, and the group that proposed it had a number of things they wanted to do. And fortunately or unfortunately, the way that they went about doing a petition and submitting it for approval had sort of structural defects or flaws. It didn't comply with the legal requirements for putting a charter amendment before the public. At that time, the Charter Commission submitted it to the city attorney, the proposal, the petition that is, and the city attorney in his review determined that it was legally deficient and that in fact some of the elements of the proposed amendment would be contrary to Minnesota law. And that's just all by way of historical background and doesn't really affect us now. But I guess other than to sort of go through the history of the charter in the city. So there was that one attempt at an amendment in the early 2000s. Then kind of late 2000s, the Charter Commission basically cleaned up the language, just brought the language forward, got rid of archaic language, got rid of gender language, and actually put in language that explained how the charter can be amended. And that was kind of a response to the failed amendment attempt. It didn't really go to the substance or you know, support or reject the substance of the failed amendment, but simply said, look, if people want to come and try and amend the charter, here's how it happens. So that update that included that language was actually approved by a unanimous city council vote, which is one of the ways that you can amend the charter. And that was really, in my view, a housekeeping type of amendment at that point. So that's kind of the history, at least as long as I've been involved. Like I say, I think my first citywide election in Corcoran, or maybe second citywide election, was when the charter was approved, and that was in the mid late 80s. So this would be really the First Amendment in quite a number of years. So getting back to, you know, what are some of the reasons for bringing this up? It was my impression that as we go forward, we're going to have some pretty distinct communities within our community and geographically defined. And we're going to have concentrated, for the most part, concentrated population centers on the east and southern part of this community and less populated areas in the western part of the community. It just seemed to me that by adopting a ward system, which a lot of cities do at some point, we can preserve the possibility of maintaining some geographic diversity on the council. And a couple of years ago, it was really kind of an academic discussion, speculative discussion. And what we've seen now is actually kind of an example where that's occurred, where and again, I don't know the candidates and haven't been involved with anybody. I know the sitting council members. I really don't know, other than the research I did in voting, what people's perspectives are on various issues. But it strikes me that we're now seeing that the council that will be seated next year, quite a few folks are going to live pretty close to one another in one corner of the city. And you know, my feeling, I think, going back was, if we do a ward system, we might at least preserve the possibility that we've got folks representing the various areas in Corcoran. There's no one right answer here. Clearly, there are pros and cons to any approach that we might take. But I just throw it out there, and have thrown it out there in the past as something to consider as we go forward. And that's really where we stand now. Again, I'll just give a little bit of background for a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to be quiet and just listen. And that is, a lot of cities who have ward systems, well, I should take that back. The question becomes, how many wards do you have? And that directly impacts how many seats you have on your city council. So, for example, if the city determined that it wanted to have 4 wards, then clearly we have 4 council members. You would have a council member elected from each ward, and the mayor would continue to be elected at large. In that case, you wouldn't have an at-large council member unless you increase the size of the council, and which then would require you to go to an even number of council members so that the mayor always represented a tie-breaking vote. And we've always had the mayor elected at large. Cities with ward systems always have the mayor elected at large. That would continue to be the case. I'm not so sure that where the city is at in terms of population, that increasing the size of the council would make sense at this point. So in doing a little bit of background, and again, I'm going to throw this out there here as one possibility that I've thought through at least, and that is, if the city adopted a ward system that replicated our current precincts, which is to have 3 wards, Ward 1, 2, and 3, and then 1 at-large council member, you get a little bit of a blend. And there are other administrative reasons why that might be easier to set up if you're replicating the precinct system. So that would blend a ward plus an at-large council with an at-large mayor. And because I've spent maybe more time researching this and thinking about how it would work and how it would be implemented, I think I'm probably several steps ahead in the analysis than maybe people who are thinking about it for the first time. So that's why I want to kind of stop talking, because I don't want to get ahead of the discussion generally. And just, I think, you know, part of the goal for the Charter Commission was to just hear additional perspectives and questions on the part of the council, because collectively, the entire group that is now on this call has the responsibility of representing the community of Corcoran in its governance, both in setting the structure of that governance and actually creating the policies and laws that guide us as a community. So that's my piece.
Thanks, Ken. I know, George, that you did also a little bit of research on your thoughts on pros and cons, and wondered if you would want to maybe share share some of that at this time, and then we can open it up for more discussion from everybody. Oh, you're muted, George.
George, you're
George,
muted.
you're muted.
Okay, yeah, something came up on my screen about updating Zoom, so I apologize for that. Yeah, I did some research. I did some checking for articles that might be available on the internet and other places about the pros and the cons of ward systems. And there's a fair amount of discussion out there that's been going on for a number of years. And I put together a list of some of the pros and cons, and I think those seem to be fairly consistent with some of the things that Jessica listed. This is probably a little more extensive, but one of the pros, obviously, is that in a larger city, particularly, Corcoran's probably kind of on the cusp of that, is that it gets pretty expensive to run an at-large campaign for a city council seat that's largely a volunteer position. So what that means is that in communities where you have concentrations of people that have maybe a higher level of economic ability, you will get more money spent on campaigns in those kinds of cases, and you can end up with areas that dominate. This has particularly been true in areas where you might have like ski resorts and things like that, where you have people that have some significant wealth versus the service folks that might live on the outskirts. One of the reasons for a ward is really to get more equal representation throughout the city, where the economics are different and where the geographic situation is different, where you might need different ordinances where you have urbanization that might look for more restrictive ordinances versus open space areas which need to be handled differently. They can still be addressed. For instance, Rogers has done some differentiation in some of their ordinances based on areas of the community. And it gets to be fairly complex in terms of setting up ordinances that way. But, you know, it is helpful to have the perspective of people who live in areas that are not as urbanized when you're looking at ordinance reviews. One of the arguments for wards is that there's more accountability by the representatives who live in the actual area of the constituents that they represent. Now, the flip side of that is there's a negative, and that is that sometimes you can experience a fair amount of difficulty in reaching consensus because you have people representing their own perspectives. We had that a little bit in Corcoran in the early 80s when we used the concept of having commissioners, one dealing with the roads, one dealing with administration, and the other one dealing with police. And there's a certain amount of polarization even amongst the council at that time, just because each of them had their own areas of responsibility. They tended to advocate for their areas. And one of the arguments for keeping at large is that you have people that are responsible to the entirety of the community, and that they are faced with running in their next election in front of the entirety of the community. And so that's an argument for keeping it as it is. As far as cost and complexity, I think, you know, if you look at the way Ken has approached it, setting it up to follow the precinct guidelines, it doesn't really add that much more. We have to wait until the census is complete, and then there's a process for establishing precincts and wards so that you get equal size. And it's easier if you can follow census blocks. That might not work exactly for Corcoran, but I think we can sort of estimate what our housing sizes are and so forth. One of the risks without wards is that if we do get an area that's overrepresented, we could see a majority of our capital improvements might be concentrated in those areas to the detriment of others. And that's, I think, been a concern that we could run into that, particularly where someone might want to do some improvements that would enhance the either the livability or perhaps some park improvements or some school-related activities, building things for the schools in the district where people are located might come into play. On the flip side of that, it is likely that if you have people that are at large, they're going to have to be somewhat careful about how they spend their money, because they might actually be perceived to be feathering their own nests if they spend the money in their own areas. And it might actually be more difficult for them to spend money in their own areas. So it can work both ways. I think, if we're concerned about a power group that would control the city and do it to the detriment of the rest of the city, the only effective way to do that is to have 4 wards and a mayor at large. The 3 wards system probably wouldn't do anything different right now for us than what we're getting with an at-large situation. In fact, it might actually make it worse because right now the concentrated folks still have an obligation to represent the community at large. So, I'm not really arguing strongly one way or the other here. I've always been a little bit reluctant to get into a ward system because of the cost and complexity and the fact that we may or may not get interested candidates in all of our areas. But I think if we start to see something happen in the community that leads us to believe that we need to have broader representation, we need to be able to move in that direction. And so I'm open to the prospect of it. I would personally lean for 4 wards and rather than the 3, but that's just I think what I'm seeing. As far as increasing the size of the council, we do have some things where we do require by statute a 4/5 majority. So we'd have to see how that works out if we were to change the size of the council. So I'll stop with it there.
Before we open it up for more comments, Ken, could you go back just real quickly? Because you did a little bit of research on if we went to 4 wards instead of 3. And your thought was maybe to have 4 wards, an at-large mayor, and 2 additional at-large councilmen, which would then increase the council to 7. Well, could you just review that just real quickly and the value of maybe going in that direction as opposed to remaining at 5 and 3 wards?
Well, I actually, Brian, I don't know that there's anything. I think that just gets into the question, more of a sort of a policy discussion. I mean, I guess to simplify the response I have to that, I think there's greater challenge to expanding the size of the council than there is to just simply adopting a ward structure.
Okay.
To try and do them both at the same time, I think maybe it's premature here,
Right.
based on our population. That's
Right.
my personal sense of it.
Right.
So I guess that was my feeling, and just George, I understand sort of the pros and cons as you've indicated with the number of wards and versus a blended ward process. And part of my thinking was starting out with a 3-ward system with the single at large is maybe easier to set up administratively than going straight to 4. But again, you and I have probably thought about it a little bit more and some of the pros and cons and challenges in that regard. Because obviously wards, and it's implicit in all of this, and I hope everybody bears in mind that wards have to be equal in population as much as practicable. So it's not the case that, you know, it's just obvious. It should be obvious and not even part of the conversation that wards would have an imbalance in population. So the challenge in constructing the wards is creating that balance. And that's why, you know, maybe a couple of months ago, as I was thinking about this, you know, when I realized that the precincts already followed some reasonable population balance, that would serve as a foundation for working into the ward system. But again, because the palette, I should say the canvas, is somewhat blank on this, there's no sort of right or wrong answer. And that's why, you know, the number of wards, having wards only with an at-large mayor, or having wards with at-large candidates, or simply remaining all at-large candidates, you know, it's just really something that's merits a lot of discussion, consideration.
Okay, thanks, Ken. So if you have a comment, why don't you just try and let me know, raise your hand or something like that, so I can acknowledge you, and then we can have some semblance of order here. Okay, Manoj.
I'm not muted, right? You can hear me. Yeah, perfect. So I've been researching this, like you said, maybe over the last 10 days, and didn't have the time that Ken or George have had. And I think I like some of the pros, and I don't like some of the cons. And it comes down to what makes sense for our city at this point in time. So one of the things I like, that I think was called out by both Ken and George here, is that you get local representation, right? So people who know each areas and understand what's relevant to a ward, or you know, depending on what you define as a ward. What I don't like is about the same concept on the flip side, being the devil's advocate here, is that we have Corcoran, the 3 precincts, going through different stages of development. And what that means for me when I look at it is you are isolating the wards now, or precincts. So let me bring back to a practical scenario, right? So let's take precinct 1, and we have some policies which the residents don't like in precinct 1. They don't like that we're going to force them all to be on water and sewer, right? Just tell them that that's what we're going to do from a city council standpoint. And all they have to fight back is one council seat that they can respond to and use their power of the elections, versus being able to make the entire council accountable for something that's was in their best interest. So that's where I feel like there's a little bit of isolation that will end up happening, because we are in 3 different stages. I did a little bit of research on cities that have implemented wards and when they do it. There is a minimum size that they start doing this. Like if you take Plymouth, I think they were 50,000 before they started doing it. And similarly, other places, there's like a critical volume they want to reach. And also the character of the entire city is not this skewed. It's not heavy, like we know the east side of Corcoran, which is mostly precinct 3, is going to have a lot of development coming up. And that is not considerably true when it look at precinct 1 or 2. Now, if we do this, they lose their power, right? The voice of the residents. So that's one thing I don't like it from either. But I like it that people from that ward or that precinct would know more about that area than somebody who's running at large, right? So that's one. I think Ken made a point. I think I agree with him. The precincts are equally balanced in size. They're anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 people, like around that vicinity. Yes, we'll have to draw the lines a little carefully so that they're more equal. But yeah, right now the precincts are more aligned. But looking at an implementation within 2 years, precinct 3 is going to definitely be bigger than precinct 1 or 2, right? And then we have census data coming out in a year plus, March 2021. Oh no, sorry. Is it? I mean, in a year's time, or in maybe I'm getting my dates wrong. But soon we're going to have the census data come out. So then, how are we going to consider that in? I was talking to a few people, and they said even our Senate district would change, right? So then you're starting to look at ballots not only going to be by school districts that we already have to deal with, but also looking at our Senate candidates and everything, local representatives and things like that. So it's going to be complicated in how we do it. I don't like the timing. I personally think that it's a beautiful concept that we might be ready for someday. I just don't think we have the critical mass and the nature of our city in how it's growing. It may not make sense. And that's, again, a personal opinion on how this, might shake out. I also, one of the things that I also wanted to, maybe throw at staff, if it's possible, to kind of understand, have we done any like-to-like comparisons of similar size cities? Like we are at 6,500, best guess. And how many cities have done it at 6,500? Or is there like a threshold where it starts making sense? Like, that's one, I looked at a few cities, but not enough to say, hey, this makes sense or not. I also ran, I hope some of you at least have seen it. I ran a poll within a few residents in Corcoran. So I put it out there on social media and to kind of look at what people think. And interestingly, I got a fair bit of balance of responses from all three precincts. And overwhelmingly, the majority said they don't know enough about the wards, right? So I think before we do anything, I think we need to get a little bit more engagement from the people to kind of figure out where they are and what they think are benefits. Because I would hate for us to do anything, and I know that this is more of a working session, is to not get additional inputs from the larger city. And with that, that's basically some of the points I had noted. Thanks for the time.
I think, Manoj, you make a good point in terms of the size, because the small cities that I've worked with over the years in my consulting have been pretty much at large. It's only when they get to a certain size that they start looking at having wards. The other reason that wards have been used is usually to remedy situations where you might have a racial minority that is concentrated in a particular area and they can't otherwise get a voice. And so they've been used in those situations. So, if you look around the metro here, you'll find a fair number of folks that have wards, but they generally tend to be the larger cities. So with our situation, I think you're right that we would have growth in one of the wards, and we would have a situation where that ward would have a disproportionately small representation on the council if we went to 4 or even 3 after a period of several years if growth continues. The only way to get around that is you'd have to have some kind of a gerrymandered system that would basically divide up a combination of urban and rural into the same areas, much like what is done sometimes with congressional districts, where they reach into the suburbs and they go out into the countryside. So, I think there is for one thing, we may or may not have a problem here, depending upon the behaviors of the people that get elected. If the people that get elected are basically representing the city as a whole, we don't need wards. But I do have some concerns long term if we have areas of the community that can't get representation because there's nobody from their area that really understands their situation.
George, I think it was a couple of years ago where we had some research from different cities, size cities and so forth. And some of them were actually out of the state of Minnesota as well that had implemented a ward system. But do you remember what that basic threshold was that once they hit this population threshold that it was, a direction that they wanted to move into with wards?
Yeah, I don't remember, Brian, a specific number. All I know is that, I've worked with a number of cities and for the most part, they're not using wards when they're small like we are.
Sure. Ken, did you come across any cities thresholds where they transitioned from, all basically independent to a ward system?
No, I didn't, Brian. The only information I have is purely anecdotal because I went and looked for other Twin City area cities with ward systems and found a little bit of a range. I think of the samples that I found, maybe the city of Ramsey was the smallest, and I don't even know what their population is. You know, and then maybe on the large side, somebody like Minnetonka.
Sure.
But I couldn't really respond to that.
Sure. Any other comments? Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, a couple things. I grew up in Minneapolis, which has long had wards, and there the ward, the council member apparently has a staff. If there's like a traffic problem in your neighborhood, you may call your council member, as opposed to trying to call somebody else, or if there's something that needs tending. So the council member becomes the go-to person for issues. And at this point, Corcoran, I don't think the council members have, because we don't have a staff, that we're not going to be fielding those questions. If people have a question about something in Corcoran, they call Brad, or they call Ron, or you know, so it won't function in that way for sure. I did a little check. In my expectation is that if we were to have wards, then the council members, is their first priority is to represent their ward, and I'm not sure that will serve Corcoran very well. I would really like all the council members to serve the entire city, and those who are living in a suburban area may not understand the you know, the problems that those of us who live in the more rural area will have, but you guys will learn. We can teach you that. I think without trouble. We'll pound on your you know, on your mailbox to let you know what the issues are. I know that even though I've been here for a long time, I certainly don't know all the issues, hardly any of the issues, maybe for the families that are still farming. But you know, I think you guys are trainable. That would be my assumption. I know I've learned a lot in my short time on the council. I did check, and you know, Maple Grove has no wards. Rogers has no wards. Dayton, Medina has no wards. Brooklyn Center has no wards, although their mayor has a 4-year term, which the mayors may like. Hopkins has no wards. It's all at large. Plymouth is the one that has 4 wards and 2 at-large positions. That was kind of the only exception that I found. I didn't do a lot of searching, but I checked out those areas. I just it's a road that we go down, and I'm just not sure that I want to go there. So that's sort of my feeling on the matter.
All right, thanks, Tom. Anybody else? Go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Brian. So one thing to remember is this discussion is not in response to the last election. It's in preparation of all future elections as well. So don't take the discussion personally. But I do think having a concentration of power, and I'm in that corner that we're talking about, is probably not the best representation for all the city people in the city of Corcoran. So, and growth is going to continue on the east side, and in looking at the precinct map, some precincts are even going to grow faster than others. So I think we have to be mindful of that. One of my questions is if we do go to a ward system, are we locked into evaluating wards every 10 years, or can we do it more often than that, just for the fact that we're going to have rapid growth within that 10-year cycle on the east side of the city of Corcoran?
I think the answer to that is we're probably mandated to do it every 10 years with the census, but to do it more frequently would require a fair amount of staff time to come up with the populations, because again, we do have some differences in the size of households, and those change from time to time depending on the age of the community. Some of our older parts of the community, we've lost population because the kids have all moved away. So unless the house is sold to a new family, the population per household is smaller. So it's pretty hard for the staff to figure out where that population center is going to fall. And it would be a lot of work, I think, to make that between the 10-year periods. And so what we're dealing with is every 10 years we would redo it. There were times in Minnesota here where we had Senate districts that reached over 100,000 people between redistricting. It's pretty hard to find, well, some of them I guess are getting maybe that large now, but you can have some very significant disparities when you have growth going on in an area. And over time, people get underrepresented as a result of that. So I think, at this point in time, it would be very difficult to do anything other than a 10-year renewal.
Okay, to the I have a few more questions, Ken, if you don't mind. But
No, go ahead, Alan.
to the point about somebody made about the size of the city and what cities flipped over to ward systems versus not being at ward systems, I think it's important to note that most of the cities that we're looking at are pretty much geographically diverse with their population, whereas we're not that way. We're heavy on the east side as far as population, and that population centers continue to going to get heavier on the east side versus growth in the overall city. So to me, that's a plus for wards. I wouldn't be supportive of expanding the council. I think making a decision with 5 members on the council right now, 4 council members and a mayor, can be difficult enough at times, and putting 2 more people on the council may it may spur additional conversation that may not add the amount of value that we think it would provide. So whether we go to a ward system or not, I wouldn't be in favor of supporting additional seats. Somebody talked about, having, if you are in a ward system, you're going to be accountable for your own ward and probably not take into consideration the members of outside your ward. I would warn you that your phone is not going to stop ringing based on geographic location of the electorate. You're going to get phone calls from whoever it is, whether they're in your ward or not, and you're still going to answer them. So, and then with regards to if we did go to a change, how do you envision the election cycles changing or not changing? If you went to a ward system, would you have all the candidates in the various wards up for election every cycle, or would you still stagger? Has there been thought around that?
Ken did some work on that, but it would be a staggering system. It would take a couple, maybe elections to get there, but there wouldn't be like wholesale turnover in one election, which is the purpose of, to try and keep some measure of continuity. That's why they're staggering there. But Ken, maybe you want to address that more clearly.
Sure, Brian. Alan, in the sample of city ordinances that I was able to locate, most of them did have a transition period over the course of at least a couple of elections where they achieved the full system that they were trying to implement. And a couple of things that they did that were common features were that no council member loses their term because of their placement in a ward. So if during the transition period you have 2 incumbent council members in a ward, for example, they both serve out their full term, that type of thing. But again, it's all the mechanics and how you which wards are elected at what point in time. And I wanted to add, it's a little bit of a transition on that. some of the benefit of combining an at-large seat with the wards is that it gives you more flexibility in that transition phase. Because with the opportunity to run at large, if you do have two incumbents in one ward, then, and they both want to run for re-election, one of them can run for the at-large position and one of them can run as the ward candidate. But I actually wanted to comment specifically on the challenge of having significant population growth between the time of the censuses. And I think George is right, you're mandated to adjust per the census, but I haven't seen anything that would prohibit you from adjusting in between the census. It would just be really difficult, particularly for a smaller community, to have the resources to be able to do that. But for example, in a system, if for example, the city of Corcoran had 3 wards, 1 at large, and then a 2-year mayor, it will always be the case that the significant population concentration will be effectively electing 3 of the votes on the council. Because even though in a 3-ward system you have a concentrated population not voting those 2 other wards, effectively they can dictate the outcome of the mayoral and the at-large election. And we elect a mayor every 2 years. So practically speaking, the concentrated majority will have the majority of votes on the council. But what you continue to have is a seat at the table for the minority population centers. And you could say the council as a whole has to govern the city as a whole. It's just, what are the perspectives that are contributed to the conversation as you're going through the decision-making process. And even if you have imbalances between the period of the census, if we had 3 wards, 1 at large, and a 2-year mayor, the concentrated populations are still going to elect 3 of the votes on the council. It's just going to happen. So there is that one safeguard in that regard.
Anybody else?
Just to add to, true, I think Alan and Ken makes a couple of valid points there, right? So the one thing that I think I mentioned this before, so we're going to go by the census data if I hear right? We are small enough as a city not to spend extra money and tax people, right, for doing this more frequently. And if we don't do it more frequently, because of the fact of how certain sections of the city is going to grow, you're going to have the next 10 years based off a census data that has maybe 25% of the growth factored in. And to Ken's point, if we end up being a few at-large seats, or at least 1 at-large seats, yes, there might be an option there, they have 2 representations there. But factually, if you look at it, I've heard this multiple times that on the east side, there's more affordable housing. At least I've been told that. And if you look at from a racial mix, right, it's more minorities that have moved into on the east side. So if you look at both this together, then you start having. I am worried about the optics of how it will look. That we took the lowest time of population size they can be in. I mean, obviously, the census this is the time the census comes out, right? And then we kind of block out the ward saying that this is the ward, right? Versus wait and see where the population is going to end up, at least some sort of stability where we feel like that the size of precinct 3 is big enough to overwhelm the city. Because today that's not the case. Precinct 1 is still the bigger precinct. If you look at the number of people, precinct 2 and precinct 3 are pretty close. 3, I think 3 is a little higher than 2, but pretty close. So precinct 1 is still the bigger precinct. And for the overwhelming to happen, you need at least another 2 to 3 years. So that, it's about when do you want to balance that out? I think it's a good point that we have to protect the entire city from one section, but do you do it too early that you penalize some sections because they are now underrepresented, or are you? So that's, for me, it's more about timing. I see the benefit. So it's about when you do it and what size does the city get to before that cost or that administrative process the city has to follow is not prohibitive. So that's where I am. I just wanted to leave that out on the table.
Thanks, Manoj. Go ahead, George.
One of the problems we have is that the census blocks that are going to be coming out for us are probably not going to align nice and neatly with precincts. So there still is a fair amount of work that has to be done to parse those census blocks to make for an equal distribution. Now, I'm not sure that precincts are required to be equal, but wards are. And so I think precincts, there's been an effort to try to make them somewhat equal, even though they may not be. I think if we go to wards, we definitely have an obligation every 10 years to make sure that that point in time that they are equal. And that does require parsing census blocks that, you know, in some of the literature that I read, that was one of the difficulties, is that you very rarely had a situation where all of the census blocks lined up just nice and neatly, so that staff could grab a census block and place several of them together to get a ward.
I not to say that staff didn't do a lot of work in setting up the precincts, but I think the precincts were originally in, I don't mean to make light of this, but it was crudely drawn to make it the simplest form for people to follow. I live on this side of the street, I'm in this precinct, I'm in that side of the street, I'm in that precinct. And we had to split it up. Jessica, there was work involved, I know that. But it's not like the census data and hiring. So I don't think we'd follow a precinct map no matter what we did. We'd have to put a lot more effort into it.
Can I ask a couple technical questions?
Go ahead, John.
What is the required timing on this? For example, do we have to have this done by a certain date?
My understanding is no, that the earliest it would be done would be the 2022 election. That would be the earliest that it would apply. But nothing prior to that.
No, I mean that getting the, I guess, deciding in the future we're going to be in wards, is that something that needs to be done in the next 6 months or in the next year? Or
are you saying if you want it effective for the 2022 election, what's the last date we have to start rolling with this?
Sorta, yeah.
You would have to make a decision ahead of the time period where the census data comes out, because there's a time frame. I think it's 60 days from the time that the census data is available until the time that the wards would get delineated. At least there was some literature about that the last go around 10 years ago when the census data came out and the wards were realigned at that time. And there is data, or there is an instruction that comes from the state on how that's to be done in the time frame. So if a decision were made to go forward with wards, you would want to do it fairly soon if you want to get it for the next election, because once that census data comes out and is presented, there is a timeline.
Okay. So as the time I've been on council, I have, maybe I'm just not perceptive, but I've never had it seem like if you lived in a certain area that you paid a greater focus on just your neighbors. And I don't know if I get that sense, today. I know we've been talking about wards for a while, and the reason I ask about timing is it seems kind of knee-jerk, but it especially seems I've been on council for 4 years, and I believe this would be the biggest decision that I would ever be a part of. And so I think everyone on this call has been on city council in one form or another, and for at least the first couple of weeks, I was just trying to figure out where the meetings are. And we've got brand new people that haven't even been sworn in yet. So I think a couple of things are important to me is, one, since it has to be a 5-0, I would get a read quickly on how much work you want to do by judging the reactions of the council members as a whole. And then two, I wouldn't want somebody making this kind of decision right out of the gate when you have no experience being on city council. Not to say that you make bad decisions when in your early days of city council, but I think there needs to be a understanding of the flavor and what goes into it and that kind of stuff. So for my time, for whatever it's worth, my time on the city council, I have felt like we're all in it together for the good of everybody in Corcoran. I haven't had a sense that people are in it for their neighborhood or whatever. And I think if you just represented one area of town right now, you probably wouldn't be elected, be found out in one election cycle. But I'm open to that happening, I guess, and understand that it can. But so my comments are, before you guys put any more work into it, I'd weigh whether anybody is really against it. And then also, let's get some experience behind the council before they make probably the biggest decision they'll ever make while they're on council.
Anybody else? Comments? I don't see everybody, so go ahead, Jeremy.
You're on mute.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, very good. I want to applaud the Charter Commission for taking up one of the timeless American dilemmas. How do you protect the minority from being tyrannized by the majority? We've got an elaborate system of checks and balances all up and down local and national government to try to control just this issue. And I applaud that sentiment. From a values perspective and a policy perspective, my take on it is, as a resident, before I decided to run for council, I was very grateful that the entirety of the council was accountable to all of the residents. To Manoj's point, I think a couple others made this point as well. I was very grateful that everybody was obligated to respond, not just because they are good people, but because of their accountability as an elected official, to consider the perspectives of everybody in the community. And so I would be, from a values perspective, I would like to maintain that accountability personally. But I do certainly acknowledge that there are legitimate worries that people can have if they're concerned that bad actors will end up assuming positions of authority over them. But that's always been a concern for Americans, and rightly so, based on our understanding of world history, right? So, but I guess I would see other protections are already in place to deal with that. As Councillor Bottom pointed out, we are still accountable to the entirety of the electorate. I don't think we will ever get to the point where we will have such an imbalance of population that somebody will be able to maintain a damaging role on the council. And if they began acting in that way, I feel like there are so many ways to deal with that as a resident, from the ongoing opportunities to be involved in the council meetings, from being able to opine on social media and contact all the other councilors. I feel like there are a lot of checks that are already in place informally, and with the communication practices that we as a city have put in place to allow access for residents to opine, not just generally, but on specific items on the agendas, I feel like we will be able to manage that risk going forward. And I'm a little bit concerned about the idea of it actually fostering sectionalism between different parts of the city. I don't think anybody would necessarily ignore areas outside of their wards, but you might put more of a fine point on the people who you represent and maybe give those areas more weight rather than being a more even-handed decision maker, considering all the perspectives. And I think in my experience as a project manager, it's very valuable to make sure that you are able to balance all of those perspectives equally and not feel like you have one particular dog in the fight. And I think that would tend to run counter to the idea of wards. So that's my perspective right now, but I am certainly open to learning more about the idea and seeing it continue to be debated and discussed in more detail.
And I'll go ahead, Alan.
I just have a question. What would the process be if you didn't have a candidate running in a ward? Because over the years, we've had issues where you sometimes have very few candidates running for at-large positions.
Then Jessica would be on the city council. That's how that would work, Alan.
Right. Alan, it would be an empty seat on the council that the council itself would fill for that term.
We'd end up appointing somebody.
Yeah. To fill
However, that would
term.
only be if there were not a write-in candidate that could get 12 votes and win as a majority vote getter,
Okay.
like Jessica Bisey.
Yeah,
Vote for Jess.
In articles, I have seen cases where people prank their neighbors if there aren't any candidates and end up appointing people who aren't willing to those roles. So
That's usually really small cities do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I didn't really say how I felt about it. I do like the idea of, I almost think like 2 wards, but I don't want to have 4 wards for sure. I think that's counterproductive in representation. And I'm open to discussing it more, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, so your thoughts, John, are what, like 2 wards, 2 at large, and the mayor?
Yeah,
Is
no,
that-
I'm not putting my stake there. I'm just saying, I think we need to we need to make sure the west side doesn't get unrepresented and they don't have a say in anything. I think that's really important. But I don't think we need to divide the city into 4 parts. I think that's counterproductive. So I'm saying wards are good in a minimal type of fashion.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't see everybody, so I can't tell if someone else is raising their hand, so. Okay.
Brian, no one's
go ahead.
using the raise their hand function, so.
Okay. Well, the 9 people I see, you can just raise your hand, so.
Brian?
Yes, go ahead, Ken.
One of the challenges, and maybe we could get a little feedback from everybody here, this is the kind of concept that I sense is neither entirely bad nor entirely good. And we can all come up with a list of pros and a list of cons and acknowledge that there's not one correct answer here. The challenge within the setting of decision making and how we're allowed to proceed with decision making is how do you go from broad discussions to actually crafting proposals or finding out. So for example, the folks that felt it might be premature, I guess maybe the next step or the follow-up on that is you just wait. You just, table the conversation for a couple of cycles and bring it back. Maybe that's the follow-up. For folks who think, well, let's kind of continue exploring this real time, that's a little trickier. And frankly, it's no different. The challenge is no different. Maybe if we wait a couple of election cycles and revisit the conversation, how do you go from the broad pros and cons to actually crafting something and building a consensus around it? And John's last comments were instructive because, again, having sort of been looking at the map for a while and thinking, how could this work? How would it work in the city? I thought through 2 wards, 2 at large, 4 wards, no at large, 3 wards, 1 at large, council of 7, 4, and 2, that kind of thing. And those are all possibilities, but getting from the discussion to what would actually be a starting point or to work at is a challenge, particularly given the fact that we're not allowed to have offline conversations with people. particularly, as a council, open meeting law, and as a charter commission, open meeting law restrictions constrain us from sort of having the discussions other than in this type of setting.
Do we have the ability, do we have to vote on as council, or because there's a note in here about having it on a general election referendum?
No, you're right. You're right. And that's a good point, John, too, is that there are a couple of different paths. The one path, which works well for housekeeping types of things, like putting gender neutral language into the charter, is to have the council do it. If it's not controversial, if it's not a big policy question, having the council do it's an efficient way to do it that requires unanimous council vote. For larger policy issues, there's always the general election approach, which is you go through the charter amendment process and you simply submit it to the public as a ballot question in one of the general elections, in a citywide election.
So maybe if there's not enough current support at the current council or soon to be future council, maybe people want to think about working towards adding it to the 2022 general election to go in effect to the 2024 election cycle. I mean, I'd definitely be supportive of that.
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I would agree with maybe deferring it at least for another year. I like John's comment about allowing some of the new members to gain some experience on the council. And I think, you know, we've had one experience in my time of working with the city where we had a council that what I would call a rogue council. And I think you know who I'm referring to. That created a lot of havoc in the city. And I think going through the back of the minds of some of the folks that have been around a while, that's always a worry when you get folks that come in, you know, as a group, whether their agenda is for the good of the city or for some other reason. And for the last time it was to get retribution over something that they didn't like in the city, and that didn't work out very well. Hopefully this time we're dealing with people who are not going to do that, that are going to come in and represent the city as a whole and do a good job. And I think we do have the opportunity in the future, if things don't work out, to come back to this. You know, how much change would occur within the next couple of years just as a result of changes that, you know, a new group might push through. I don't hear anybody saying that they're looking to make massive changes yet at this point in time. I think there's probably enough reason to just simply put it on hold, keep it in the agenda, and if it's something that we need to do in the future, we can still do it.
So, Manoj here, just to add on, I think I like the way Alan put it, and to George's point that if we can draft a question up, right, and have it on the ballot for the city to decide, that would definitely give a lot more insight, and I would be very supportive of that. The one question I had related to that is, if we do defer it for one cycle, right, goes on a citywide election as a question, as a referendum, and the city tells us what they want, and then we move towards implementing it. If that's the scenario, in 4 years, is there a mechanism we can install now? And this goes back to Ken's point of how do we start making this more of an actionable plan, right? So we're going to have census data come out, which is baseline today. Can we keep track of all the homesteads that's happening, or or new residents moving in through the normal process that the city goes through to get the incremental count of the difference, so that when we do get the city respond back and say, yep, we want to do this, that we are like census plus this information that we have been collecting and preparing for this, and use that for the 2024 election. I mean, that's where I would be. I would be very supportive of something like that, which goes out into a ballot and the city decides, and we have a mechanism to look at the actual population at that point in time that we can do incrementally now. And I leave that to the staff to kind of decide if it is even viable. And I don't know how much strain that puts on the team, so I definitely want to be conscious of that. I also want to leave a point where as you know, I just got elected, and one of the proudest things that happened to me on election night was to see the votes in precinct 1 and 2, right? So I would love to go back to the city if I was on council, running for council ever, to make sure that I'm acceptable to everybody versus my neighbors, and how I operate and how I carry myself, and my decisions should it be reflective of what the city wants as a whole. And that's why I feel like I've always want to go out at large. That's me personal, but I also see Ken's point of, hey, the West Side needs to make sure there's a seat on the table, right? I think I agree with that. So I'd be open to it going on a ballot and then the city deciding.
Go ahead, Jer.
In terms of the specific implementation, if it were going to proceed, I guess I would be more comfortable with John's suggestion of 2 wards and 2 at large, because then at least for residents, they're going to have 4 of the 5 who are accountable to them directly. That would be, I think, my preferred embodiment if we were going to go ahead at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead, Tom.
Just a quick comment. When we get the census data, it might be really instructive to have, without a great deal of details, some potential wards sketched out, just using the kind of the blocks. And I don't know anything about the census data. What would some sort of close precincts look like, wards look like? Because I'm just not sure that it will. I just don't know where those lines would fall. Do a sketch with four wards, and do a sketch with 3 wards, and do a sketch with 2 wards, just so we can see what that map looks like. I think there could well be some surprises there in terms of the balance of population. So a little more information that way would be, I think, helpful.
Yeah, I do.
Person.
Yeah. The one thing we do know is what, at the present time, what has already been approved in terms of future development, such as Tavara, which is 550 homes, another couple hundred homes in Del Webb with the recent acquisition, the Sawgrass, the homes there. So we kind of have an idea in the city, where those homes are going to be at, and an approximate population based on, how many the homes are being built. And so I do think that maybe sticking to our current precinct boundaries may not work. That was maybe a good place to start to have a discussion. But obviously there's mandates to require equal population. And so as these developments take place, and who knows what might happen in the next 4 years as well, as they come before the city council, that will all reflect, obviously, population growth in certain areas. So I can personally envision on a geographical way where some wards might be rather small in terms of geographic space, and a very larger ward, because it'll take that larger ward just to equal the population of the other one. But I think we have, I think what I'm picking up anyways is that we'd like to put this possibly on the ballot in 2022. I think in the meantime, we're going to see how our city develops in terms of population growth and where that growth is. It'll give us some idea as to maybe how to break down the city into wards. Is it going to be 2? Is it going to be 3? Also, just the fact that there will be more development and more revenues coming from that development that hopefully will be able to not bite into the taxpayers too much to implement some of the things we have to do with the staff. So any other comments or questions? Well, I want to thank the City Council for making the time to be here tonight. This has been really good. Thank you, Ken, also for all of your work, and George, yours as well. And we do have a Charter Commission meeting next Thursday, and we can kind of capsulize again and revisit this and so forth. I think at this juncture, I don't know that we actually need to give the staff any direction at this juncture. I think we can give, are you in agreement with that, Brad? Do you think there's any instruction needed to give to the staff after tonight?
Not tonight. So what I will do, Chair and members, is on the agenda for next week, we'll put this on the agenda and just ask for formal direction from the Charter Commission. And what I'm hearing at this point is it might be a direction to staff to, upon receiving the census data, draft something that could work for a couple and then schedule a Charter Commission meeting to continue the discussion. So that might be the recommended direction that I put in a staff report for next week.
Sure.
So
Any
Brian,
other yes, go ahead.
So you normally meet once a year as the Charter Commission?
At least once a year. Sometimes
Okay.
we meet more often than that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we get some updates more frequently to council.
Yeah, we. I think this item would obviously give us reason to maybe meet more. We're required by law to meet once a year, and usually there hasn't been a whole lot of hell breaking loose in the city, so we haven't needed to meet more than once a year to meet our legal requirements, you know.
Yeah.
But this is, I think this is an item that needs further discussion among probably the Charter Commission with feedback from obviously the council and maybe even members from the community. And we can kind of look at some more options, massage it a little bit, and then keep a dialogue open with the city council.
Right, I think that'd be a good idea to make sure that we either stay on track or we decide to put it on hold completely at some point in the future. We don't want you to do 2 years worth of work and then we say no.
Right, right. Well, I do like, I guess, the idea of putting it before the people too. I think there's something to be said about that. This is as John mentioned, it would change how the city is. And, you know, although I am confident that the city council has the ability to adjudicate that and make a decision, but sometimes it's better to broaden it and have it a more broad input. And so I'm fine with that too. Ken.
Just a real quick one. For any of the council members newly elected who may or may not be able to listen in to the Charter Commission meeting next week, I think this topic itself, my sense is all I would want to talk about is sort of constructive next steps based on the feedback and inputs here. But Brad and Jessica, maybe in advance of that, you could remind everybody on the terms. I know Dorothy resigned, so it would be helpful for everybody to know what the terms are, what spaces are open on the Charter Commission itself. So everybody on this call, newly elected council members, if they know somebody in the community who's looking for a chance to get involved, you know, most of the good people come to city government by invitation or by encouragement. Someone encourages them to do it. It's been my experience over the many, many years that very few people just kind of show up by themselves. So, right. But we all need to know, do we have one seat open, 2 seats open? And it goes obviously with all of the parks and trails and planning as well. We here collectively are the recruiters.
Yeah.
I mean that in the positive sense.
Yeah. Good. Any other comments or thoughts? Okay, hearing none.
I want to thank you. I want to thank the Charter Commission for you guys do a lot of work behind the scenes, and grateful for all you do.
Yes,
echo
that.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and we'll continue to do so. With that, can I get a motion to adjourn our meeting here tonight?
Also move. George.
George, thank you, George. In a second.
Second.
Thank you, Ken. All in favor? Let me, Lothar, aye. Christensen, not here. Gmach,
Aye.
Gunther,
Aye.
Manoj, Thomas,
Aye.
Tilbury. Do we have a thumbs up? Well, anyways, Brad, you can.
Jim, Jim has raised his hand.
Okay. Good.
Jim, you are not muted. If you'd like to speak.
Did he want to speak, or was he just raising his hand to agree with?
I think we've got enough votes to adjourn, Brian.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. Okay, good. Well, we'll officially close this meeting, and thank you everybody for being here. And we have a city council meeting in a few minutes here. So then again, thank you to the Charter Commission and all your work, especially Ken and George. Take care.
Good luck to council members.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.